Let's start, guys, by addressing some of the things Chris just talked about and some of his recommendations. Do you agree that we would be better off by legalizing all forms of sports gambling?
I'm not sure about that. Speaking from a former law enforcement perspective, I'm not sure that legalization of every possible ill is always the answer. There are some reasons for things to be illegal and not, but regulation and self-policing, I do believe, are integral to making any business entity, including sports entities, as corruption-free as possible. And so I would just say that.
Rick, can we regulate, though, sports betting if it's not legal? Can we effectively regulate it?
Not if it's not legal. I'm 100% with Chris. I'm all in favor of legalizing and regulating. That's the model we employ in Great Britain. We have a gambling commission which regulates. We have sports governing bodies working in cooperation with betting operators. We have a very, very liberal approach. You can bet on absolutely everything.
Seems that
so
the gender of the royal babies. And
oh, absolutely, yeah. The color of the Queen's coat, you name it. I mean, it can.
And that's a good thing for society.
I'm not judging where it's a good thing for society. I'm talking about how you regulate it and control it. The point being, there is no incentive for anybody to have to bet offshore. They can bet on whatever they like, but they do it in a regulated environment, and it works. So for me, that's why the US hasn't taken that on board. I haven't the faintest idea. It's more challenging, I think, in Asia. And we also, in Great Britain, get the sort of the doomsayers saying, well, why are we bothering when 90% of the markets are unlicensed and unlawful in Asia? But you've actually got to get your own house in order and then hope the rest will follow. But for me, absolutely, legalize it and regulate it, because you ain't going to stop it. Nobody's telling me there isn't a huge volume of betting in the United States.
There is. Bill, this isn't necessarily your bailiwick, but do you want to talk about it?
Well, I might as well even things up here. The mantra legalize and regulate is being applied here inconsistently when you look at the issue of doping and the issue of betting. I mean, we don't say legalize drugs and then regulate them. We say keep the drugs out of sport. So the fundamental question is betting a good thing for sport? And if you want to be logically consistent, you have to answer that question. And I haven't heard an argument for betting is a good thing for sport. That's where you start, I think.
Isn't the question, is betting a good thing for society? I mean, who's saying it's not lawful to wager and bet? It's a legitimate leisure pastime. The impact on sport is the bit that's got to be controlled.
Yeah, and I think there is a huge societal impact for betting. I mean, we understand that there are societal problems that are brought in, and that there's potential for corruption of the game. You can't tell me that you put more millions of dollars on the incentive side to corruption, that you're not going to see that a greater potential for corruption. And the experts will tell you, as Rick just did, that you can't regulate betting globally. So is the argument that we should take a whole new course, legalize sports betting because we can regulate 10% of it? That to me doesn't seem like a logical approach.
But let me ask you. You spent decades at the U.S. Justice Department, and of course, as Chris mentioned, and everyone in the room knows, the Justice Department played a large role in what's going on now with the collapse of FIFA as we knew it. With all of the priorities, with all of the things that the American government, especially the federal government, has to focus on in a dangerous world, where does sports corruption stand?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, look, law enforcement only gets involved when self-policing, good governance, regulation all fail spectacularly. And really that's the place where law enforcement steps in, where nothing else works. And I think law enforcement believes that, and I think most people in the United States believe that that's the appropriate place for someone like the Justice Department. That having been said, I mean, for years and years, and it continues to be said, foreign corruption, domestic corruption continues to always be a core priority for the Justice Department. It always has been. It's because other entities are sometimes unable to police themselves. It's just a reality, and so it's always been a core priority. And in fact, when the Justice Department doesn't step in on domestic corruption issues, on foreign corruption issues, oftentimes there's no one else to step in. And so I'm not suggesting that sports corruption is the highest priority, but there is a place for it given what has happened and frankly the fallout that we've seen since the indictments that came out.
I mean, there were people all over the world applauding the actions of Loretta Lynch and Jim Comey, saying finally somebody has stepped into this void to take control. The template that has been created, Bill, and of course USADA has had some experience with federal investigations that haven't gone quite as successfully. If we're talking about Lance Armstrong, for instance. The template created in terms of going after people who may only be tangentially related to the U.S. banking system, but there were transactions, spreading its tentacles that way. Is that something you expect to see more of from Washington?
Well, you use the word void, and I think that's exactly why the government is there. There is a void of regulation, oversight, and corporate good governance within some sports organizations. And so if sport cleans itself up, I don't think you'll see government stepping in. But if sport doesn't, and thus far the lessons going from cycling to soccer and of course the WADA investigation going on about potential corruption related to the doping practices of the IAAF, we're not seeing the reform. So if we don't see the reform, then I think we'll continue to see government stepping in.
Rick, what was the message you thought, the bigger message when you saw Loretta Lynch and Jim Comey at that extraordinary press conference back in May in Brooklyn?
Profound depression that it was necessary, but profound gratitude to them for actually stepping in, because I think having worked in soccer for 25 years and successfully kept FIFA well and truly at arm's length, it was very well overdue. And I think the problem is, there's a big debate now about the leadership at FIFA and where we go next, and the presidential campaign, and there's an enormous challenge for any new leader because it's not about tinkering with structures, it's all about a complete change of culture. It's about an organization that needs new values of honesty, transparency, fairness, consistency, which should have been there all along but aren't. But I think that sport is not going to reform itself overnight, and it's going to take external agencies, not just governments, but for me, and picking up one of the points Chris made about the way the corporate sector has reformed itself, for me, one of the answers is for the sponsors to actually step in and simply make it a condition of every one of their contracts that sports governing bodies have to accept the same levels of corporate governance that the sponsors do in corporate life. That would solve the problem fairly quickly.
As newsworthy and as notable as it was to see the U.S. DOJ get involved with FIFA and round up people all over the world, it might have been just as consequential, if not more so, that the Swiss have decided enough is enough and are aggressively prosecuting this case and investigating this case. And there could be ramifications, of course, not just for FIFA, but for the dozens of international sports organizations that are chartered in Switzerland. The fact that Michael Lauber, the Attorney General of Switzerland, and the government in general seem to be saying we don't want the rest of the world to think of Switzerland as a haven for corrupt sports organizations. What could be the consequences there, like that?
Well, I think it's an extraordinary message. I mean, it's an extraordinary message to send from that country, but also a very good and I think heartening message about cross-jurisdictional cooperation, that on these matters it's not going to be about turf, law enforcement turf, but that there is going to be coordination. And that's clear from what we've seen already, that there's been cooperation across countries on arrests, on mutual legal assistance requests, on document sharing, on all of that. And I think it's heartening that there are law enforcement agencies that can work together.
You're no longer in the government, but where do you see this particular joint investment? Well, joint's probably not the right word, but parallel investigations. Where do you see them going?
Well,
The world of cycling, many people considered it hopelessly corrupted. We've seen Lance Armstrong stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles. We've seen many of the men who won titles before him stripped of their titles. And we've also seen the International Federation that oversees cycling, the UCI, accused of covering up for people such as Lance Armstrong. What are the challenges for an organization such as USADA or WADA at the global level when the federations themselves, these sports governing bodies, have an incentive to pile stuff under the rug?
Yeah. Well, specifically in the Armstrong case, we understood the likelihood was that if we sanctioned Lance Armstrong, the UCI would appeal and try to overturn the sanction. And the counterweight to that was that we understood that under the rules, after a first instance decision by USADA, we could put the evidence in front of the public. And USADA did that by publishing all the evidence on its website, just like we publish arbitration decisions, and Lance gave up his right to go to an arbitration. And so it was that transparency that brought accountability. And I think that's very important, and because the right decision was made in that case, not because the right motives were present, but because the information was open and accessible. Recently, this year, the Cycling Independent Reform Commission issued its report, and we've seen a lot of the correspondence, actually communications going back and forth between Pat McQuaid and Lance's legal counsel, and Pat McQuaid's lawyer for cycling and Lance's legal counsel, even during our case. So, the challenge in our case was we were facing an international federation was directly in opposition to the truth coming out and the rules being enforced. How frequently that occurs, I don't know, but we need a different system so that there is more transparency, accountability, and openness.
Rick, when those of us in the U.S. think about corruption in sport, cheating in sport, we might think about something like Deflategate and the pressurization of footballs. From your perspective right now, what are the greatest threats to the integrity of global sport?
Wow. Well, I think we've touched on them, and Chris touched on them very eloquently earlier. Match fixing is certainly it's certainly a massive threat across sports, and again, it's not just the simple fixing of a game. I mean, we had instances, if we're going to talk about tampering with equipment, we've had instances in the Premier League in England in the 1990s where there was floodlight failure through sabotage because the Asian bookmakers were paying out on the result at the time the game was abandoned. So we've had to be vigilant in all sorts of areas that we wouldn't have expected. But what we're seeing with FIFA now is, we're seeing equal danger from off the field corruption tarnishing the very image of a sport. So it's one thing to deal with it on the pitch, which is complicated enough, but when you've also got to deal with it off the pitch, that's a whole new set of challenges.
How can match fixing, which you identify as one of the most significant threats, how can it properly be policed, though, when the resources available to those who are supposed to police it are so limited, and the resources of those who might actually fix a match are so vast? And of course, there are 207 member nations of FIFA. There are countless club teams all around the world participating in FIFA-sanctioned events and Confederation-sanctioned events. Isn't it an almost impossible task?
It's a huge task. I don't think it's an impossible task, but the only way you can tackle it is through collaboration. It can't be left to sport alone, because you know, one of the fundamental differences between, well, there are two differences between corruption and match fixing and, for example, doping, in that doping is cheating to win. You cheat to win. You can't corrupt to win. You can't offer somebody more money in order to play better. You corrupt to lose. And the difference with that, of course, is that undermines public confidence, sponsor confidence. It undermines the very being of sport if people aren't actually doing their best. So corruption is corrupting to lose, and it also involves outside influence by definition. You're talking about two parties. Very often you're talking about criminals and sports people. Sports governing bodies can do their best to deal with their own participants, and indeed they must. They must have the right rules, they must have disciplinary processes, but they can't deal with the criminals. So they need support of law enforcement agencies to work alongside them. And as Chris said, across the globe you also need the support of governments. This is all about, it's all about collaboration and a multi-agency approach.
Mike, give us a sense. You know, we just got done with the World Series here in the U.S., and you know it's been almost 100 years, 96 years since the World Series was fixed, which was the greatest threat, you could argue, to the national pastime that we've ever had in 160 years of playing baseball. There hasn't been anything on the scale of that since then, but there have been the occasional football scandals, basketball with Arizona State, college football with Northwestern. How many people at the national level in law enforcement are keeping an eye on things like that?
Yeah, I think this sort of dovetails with the answer I gave before about whether this is a high priority or not. I think that corruption in general is a high priority, but I can't say for certain that sports corruption is within that broader area is the highest priority. That having been said, the sort of charges that we saw in the FIFA case were significant. They were racketeering, vote buying, sponsorship fixing. This is not little stuff, and so that there was an appropriate place for law enforcement there. And so when we talk about sports corruption, we're talking about a wide range of activities, and they're not all the same. But I think most people agree that this particular action by DOJ was warranted and appropriate and certainly proportional.
I think that's one of the keys that we found in Great Britain, that if you simply talk match fixing, that's not a massive priority for the police. They have more important things to do. But if you start talking about money laundering and racketeering, then the ears prick up, because that becomes much more serious. And increasingly you're seeing evidence that they are inextricably linked to match fixing. So, you know, again, there is every incentive to get involved.
Bill, what was the lesson that USADA might have learned when the federal investigation of Lance Armstrong essentially was called off and you had to proceed on your own?
The rules are different. There's certainly a role for independent anti-doping agency to move forward, where in that instance the U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California made a decision not to go forward. So I think the fundamental lesson is the importance of an independent anti-doping organization to enforce the rules of sport related to sports doping.
What's at stake right now with the Floyd Landis whistleblower case?
Well, besides $90 to $100 million in treble damages of the sponsorship fees that were paid to Lance Armstrong by the U.S. Postal Service, obviously it's important to Lance. I think there's a lot of information about how that doping occurred that is kind of dripping out. For instance, allegations recently regarding the involvement of certain key officials in cycling and potential match fixing, so shall we say, or race fixing in that case. Allegations came out in Lance's deposition about that. So I think in this case we'll continue to see more and new information about the extent of corruption that Lance and others associated with him were involved in.
As someone who's covered international sports for the last 25 years, and I've been to all the Olympics and the World Cups and Tours de France. There is certainly a cynicism among those who cover these events that people are still cheating, people are still doping, that the ability to catch these guys lags behind the ability to actually dope and cheat. What is it like being on the side that's always trying to play catch up with the latest technology, the latest chemicals? How do you project any kind of confidence in the cleanliness of global sport when they're so good at cheating?
Yeah. Well, first of all, how important is this issue? It's absolutely fundamental to the future of sport. And why does sport matter? We saw the video of the young kids playing in poor neighborhoods around the world. Sport gives hope. So we can't give up. We have to win. And what winning means in anti-doping is deterring athletes, for the most part, from doping. You will never eradicate all drugs from sport, nor will you eradicate drug use from all of society. But you can create a new culture. And a new culture is, I think, what this conference is about, what we're talking about both on the sport governance side and on the side of the game on the field and doping. It's a culture that values other people, that values integrity over what I can get for myself. And so it's exciting to see that message catching hold. It's exciting to see that there are a lot of standard bearers in sport for that message. A lot of athletes that want to be known for integrity and doing things right. And they're tremendous role models. And it's exciting to see that. So I find it encouraging. Sure, is there a lot of work to be done? Yes, but we are excited about supporting those athletes that want to do it right.
What kind of deterrent effect is there? I mean, when you turn on the World Series on Fox and there's Alex Rodriguez as a commentator and he's being celebrated in New York, a guy who has admitted twice
Right.
to cheating,
Right.
to doing things that were against the rules of the game, that are against the law, but there have been no consequences legally for him.
Sure.
What is the message then?
Personally, people are entitled to a second chance. Redemption is important, and it's an important message that we learn through sport. But for me, it was too soon. It was less than a year since he finished serving his suspension, a second suspension. Obviously lied repeatedly to the public, and he's simply not an appropriate spokesperson for the sport at this point. So I think it was a bad decision by Fox Sports, and they weren't concerned about the message that sends culturally. And I think we need to be more concerned about those messages.
Is there anything more that you think law enforcement should be doing, Mike Thalley? I mean, when you talk about guys who admitted to breaking the law, who have used drugs without these prescriptions, who have bought them illegally, whether you're talking about a Mark McGwire or an Alex Rodriguez or a Lance Armstrong, and there are no criminal complaints filed against them, there's no jail time, there are no fines, anything like that. Is that something the law should do a better job of addressing?
Well, I spoke on these sorts of topics often when I was at DOJ, and I feel the same way now, which is that resources are precious, especially on the federal law enforcement level. There are lots of different agencies that play different roles, and it's not always true that unethical behavior is also criminal behavior. It's also the case that even criminal behavior can't often, one agency can't take care of everything. And so I think from what I used to say when I was at the Justice Department, and I continue to say now, is enforcement by federal law enforcement agencies needs to be targeted, it needs to be proportional, it needs to make sense when people in the country are seeing the wide range of different things that are going wrong in the country. And when you ask things like, why is sports corruption, how high a priority is sports corruption, that's a good question. There are lots of things in the country that need fixing, and one entity can't do it all. That having been said, more resources gets you more ability to go after those things, but no matter what, it has to be proportional and targeted, I think.
Rick, we were talking earlier about the Swiss going after FIFA, going after Sepp Blatter now. Who knows where that leads? Michel Platini. How do you see whatever happens in Switzerland having a bearing on the rest of the world of sport?
Well, who knows? I mean, because who knows how far it's going to go? They're only scratching the surface, I suspect, at the moment, and there's probably a lot of people sleeping fairly uneasily in their beds. I mean, one of the issues going forwards, particularly for FIFA, for example, is, should it continue to be a lightly regulated, pretty opaque Swiss association? Given the amounts of money that are flowing through, should FIFA not be a properly regulated corporation situated in a centre where there's going to be better oversight? I mean, there are all sorts of questions raised by FIFA. I mean, look at the structure of FIFA. Look at the executive committee. Ostensibly, it was there to exercise oversight over the president and over the staff. Well, a large number of them have been arrested. Several more have been suspended. But what of the others? What were they actually doing? What oversight were they actually exercising? Not a great deal. Now, again, if FIFA were a corporation with a board of directors where fiduciary duties of directors were properly understood, then I think you'd find the bodies like the EXCO would be far more accountable. The roles are nebulous now. There's an awful lot of sort of personal favour bestowed upon people. And one of the interesting points about corruption, I mean, corruption, my favourite definition of corruption is it's abuse of power for personal gain. There's no reference to money in that. There's patronage involved as well. And I mean, by definition, sports governing bodies are rife with conflicts of interest, and to an extent that's unavoidable by their very nature. But in terms of the patronage that's bestowed by presidents, putting people on favoured committees, generous expenses, I mean, is that corrupt?
Maybe.
Maybe. Where do you draw the lines on these definitions? But it's which is why I said you do need a total change of culture, and driving change of culture that's really tough. It's really challenging. It's difficult to do just from within. So to have law enforcement agencies helping, and again, I've said to have the sponsors helping, they need to take a greater responsibility. Not coming along at the 11th hour and saying, well, this doesn't really look very good, but actually doing something more proactive about it.
I completely agree with everything Rick said. I think we ought to take what he just said as an outline for what needs to be done in terms of sport governance and improving the situation. And a dramatic example, I think, of how bad the culture is in the sport of soccer is the fact that you had to get support from 5 different nations to put your candidacy forward for the FIFA presidency. And you have people that are suspended by the ethics committee that were able to get support from 5 nations to sit for the presidential candidacy. And that's, to me, that's unfathomable. I don't understand that other than a culture that is oblivious to the world that they're existing.
Well, Sepp Blatter was overwhelmingly re-elected just days after all the arrests took place.
And
if he
and
ran today...
he probably would be tomorrow in reality.
Exactly. I mean, Thali, when you dealt with complex multinational organizations, when you have a culture in which there's this kind of structural democracy, but you've got a majority of members who don't have an interest in transparency or in curtailing corruption, how do you possibly hope to change the culture?
Well, arrests, I guess, is what happens. It's a good question. Most other corporate entities have boards of directors, boards of governors. They have independent directors. There's somebody watching. There's shareholders that you're accountable to. There's a system. And then there's regulators in certain industries, and there's law enforcement. But yeah, as I started out saying here, it's only when all of those things fail in a spectacular way that you need to arrest people. And that's what happened.
And maybe with FIFA, you've got to start again. Maybe you just got to tear it apart and start again, which is what we did in England in '92 when we formed the Premier League. We were able to start with a blank piece of paper, and we literally wrote the constitution of the Premier League one afternoon on one piece of paper, which had the virtues of simplicity, clarity, and complete transparency. And trying to remold what's actually there, I'm not sure is the answer, and maybe it's come far enough to the point where you just have to, as I said, break it apart and start all over.
I know how Chris Eaton feels. How do you feel, Rick, when you're watching, say, you're sitting at home and you're flipping through the channels and there's some qualifier for the Euros or something like that, pitting two teams against each other, on the eastern side of Europe, for instance. Are you confident that what you're seeing is clean?
I'm probably not as depressed as Chris is. I'm more of an optimist. I mean, we've had some strange instances, though it must be said, on the East, nothing connected with gambling, but we have had instances of small teams bizarrely coming from nowhere to qualify for the Champions League and finding it was not unconnected with money laundering, because it's a very efficient way of getting into the Champions League and suddenly reaping the riches from TV and sponsorship is actually quite a neat money laundering scheme. We've got it with third-party ownership of players too.
So it's club teams, national teams. There is so much opportunity.
There's a lot of opportunity, but there's also, but fortunately I tend to watch the Premier League more than Eastern European games, so there's actually a lot of good in the game still. It's not, I don't share the view it's on the edge of a precipice. I think FIFA, for me, is busted and there is a massive problem. But beneath that, and maybe this says it all about FIFA, that actually despite that, the game is going on. There's another wonderful example that I like to quote of the resilience of the game. One of the most breathtaking revelations for me from the investigations and the arrests is what's been going on in CONMEBOL, the South American Confederation. Where the rights to the Copa America for 4 tournaments were sold for $317 million. Now, I'm not an expert in bribery. I don't know what the going rate is. Is it 5%? Is it 10%? The value of the bribes on top of that contract of $317 million were $100 million. 30%. 9 out of the 10 presidents.
That's how you get an apartment at Trump Tower.
9 out of the 10 presidents of the national associations were allegedly in receipt of the funds. And yet, bizarrely, the Copa America went ahead as if nothing had happened. The tournament went ahead this year as if nothing had happened. The only mildly amusing hiccup was that none of the federation presidents were able to turn up to present the trophy for fear of being arrested. But but it actually shows the resilience of the game, and it goes on. But again, in terms of, and it touches on something Chris was saying with CONMEBOL, it's a detail, but I think that it's the explosion in the value of the rights that has caused the problem as much as anything, and it's done that in 2 respects, because one is the governance. The governance structures have not kept pace, but also there's an arbitrage factor, because at the end of the day, the teams taking part, if they see the rights go up by 200%, they think, fantastic, we're happy. They don't necessarily think, well, should they have gone up by 300%? Should we have got a lot more? But given the scale of that problem, how can people just say, well, the game's got to go on? How could people not say, enough's enough, we're actually just not going to take part until this is sorted out?
But Bill, let me ask you, and as someone I've said here, I covered a lot of baseball at the height of the steroid scandal. I was, maybe skeptical to the extent that everybody was skeptical when we saw Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire hitting all those home runs. But in the absence of any evidence, you couldn't call these guys cheaters at the time. When you watch baseball now, or you watch the Tour de France, or you watch the Olympic track and field tournament taking place next year in Rio, Is it your sense that we're watching athletes who have not been doping?
Well, first of all, we're here in New York, where the headquarters of Major League Baseball is located. And
Just
they're
about
a
20
success-
blocks down the street?
They're a success story, no question about it. That game has changed, and I think you can see it in the statistics. And there's objective evidence of a change as well as systemic evidence. And they have a great story to tell. And it's phenomenal what they've done in areas like the Dominican Republic, where about 30% of the players come from, in terms of addressing doping in those areas. So that's a tremendous success story. But yeah, I'm like Rick. I'm an optimist. I know that things like the biological passport make a difference. Now, they also put a premium on sophisticated doping, microdosing to manipulate the biological profile, and that happens, and we know it because we continue to have positive cases, and we continue to uncover doping in these sports. But I'm an optimist, but also I realize that that there is a substantial possibility that athlete that just won the gold medal is going to have to return it in 4 or 5 years when a new test is developed or something. So we haven't come close to winning the battle there. So I hope that answers your question.
Before we wrap up, I want to finish with my tally. Just ask you, the fact that the Department of Justice did what it did with FIFA, that in just a couple of weeks' time after that press conference, we saw the whole thing kind of collapse. Sepp Blatter announced that he would be stepping down. We're talking about a new presidential election coming up in February if everybody keeps their promises. How might the FIFA example embolden American law enforcement and other law enforcement agencies around the world?
Well, I think most people agree that it was the right step. I don't think anyone has suggested that DOJ overstepped its bounds here. I think everyone thought it was the right thing to do.
Nobody here. People in some other parts of the world did.
And I do think that there's a general consensus that it was the appropriate use of resources. I also think that the international collaboration is encouraging. And to the extent that you asked whether it emboldens law enforcement, I just think that in this day and age, you need that kind of collaboration in order to have a success story. You can't arrest someone in another country unless you have the cooperation of that country. You can't get the documents they need. You can't do anything unless you have cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and I think that was a good story to come out of this.
Well, I want to thank all of you for providing us with your invaluable insights. Maithali, Rick, Bill, thank you very much.